Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're looking at a few different hardware configurations to see if certain matchups work better than others. For example, when AMD Ryzen CPUs first came onto the scene back in early 2017, it was discovered that for a large amount of games, the Zen-based CPUs performed much better when paired with a Radeon GPU opposed to a GeForce GPU. Of course, the only problem with that being at the time, the Radeon RX 480 was the fastest GPU AMD had to offer, and given that it was much slower than the GeForce GTX 980 Ti, no one was using the Radeon GPU for CPU testing. Fast forward to today, and sadly the situation hasn't changed all that much. AMD's new flagship GPU, the Radeon VII, is only able to match 2017's GTX 1080 Ti, making it much slower than the RTX 2080 Ti. Also, you can't currently buy one, and that's been the situation for a few weeks now. Thankfully though, we were provided a sample by AMD, so we at least have one for a few tests.
Before we get to that, this video is brought to you by ASRock and their Z390 Taichi Ultimate motherboard. This flagship quality board fully supports Intel's 9th gen 8-core processors thanks to a 10-phase VRM design, and you get a Quantia 10 Gbps Ethernet. To learn more, check out the links in the description below.
I thought it would be interesting to test out some new and popular games using the Ryzen 7 2700X and Core i7 8700K, pair each with the Radeon VII, GeForce GTX 1080 Ti, and RTX 2080, as all three GPUs provide a similar level of performance. Now, the focus of this video isn't an AMD versus Intel CPU comparison. We've done those many times in the past. It's also not a GPU comparison. We've also done those many times in the past. So basically, the choice of CPU doesn't really matter that much. I could have used a 2600X or a Core i5-8400, for example. Doesn't really matter, not a CPU comparison. Rather, what I'm interested in here is monitoring the performance margins. Does one CPU perform better with a particular GPU, or is it now much of a muchness? I should also note that I've done all my testing at 1440p as I wanted to target more realistic gaming conditions. Again, not a CPU test, so benchmarking at 1080p or lower isn't a priority. Then both the Intel and AMD platforms were tested with 16GB of DDR4 3200CL14 memory, and any performance enhancement features were disabled. Just lastly, all the benchmark data is fresh, and it was gathered specifically for this video. For the GeForce GPUs, driver version 4.19.17 was used, and for the Radeon 7 driver version 19.2.3 was used. Okay, let's get into the results. Starting with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, we see that the three GPUs are very evenly matched for the average frame rate when testing with the 8700K. The Radeon 7 produces the best 1% low figure. Here it was 8% faster than the RTX 2080. Moving over to the 2700X, and the 1% low margin does grow quite significantly. Here the Radeon 7 is 17% faster than the RTX 2080 and 11% faster than the GTX 1080 Ti. It's very interesting to see Turing providing the lowest frame rates in this test. The average frame rates are around 9% lower with the AMD CPU. The Radeon 7, for example, saw the average frame rate drop by 11%, and then the 1% low by 9%. The RTX 2080 saw the average frame rate drop by 8%, but the 1% low dropped by 17%, so it's quite clear that the Turing GPU isn't working that well with the Ryzen processor, at least in this title anyway. And we already know that Assassin's Creed Odyssey really isn't a good game to showcase Ryzen with. Still, it's interesting to note the much weaker minimum frame rate performance with the RTX 2080. Moving on to Apex Legends, here we're testing the same section of the multiplayer mode and taking an average from 3 separate runs. Basically though, this isn't a very CPU demanding title, at least when high-end CPUs are involved. We see very similar results using either the 2700X or 8700K, and the margins are also much the same, so all looks well here. The performance seen in Battlefield 5 is pretty much what you'd expect to see. The RTX 2080 sees the biggest dip in the 1% low performance when going from the 8700K to the 2700X, but this time that can be attributed to the Ryzen CPU creating a system bottleneck in this game. The same issue is seen when looking at the average frame rate on the Radeon 7, so nothing unusual about these results. Again, pretty much what you'd expect to see. Like Apex Legends, Forza Horizon 4 isn't a particularly CPU demanding game. In fact, we know this title will happily run on a modern dual core such as the Athlon 200 GE. Still, I included it just to check if there was any funny business going on. Turns out there isn't, so let's move on. Now this is interesting. When testing with Fortnite, we see that both the GTX 1080 Ti and RTX 2080 provide better 1% low performance when paired with the Ryzen 7 2700X, quite significantly in the case of the Turing GPU. This is in stark contrast to the Radeon VII, which was slightly slower for both the 1% low and average frame rate when paired with the AMD CPU. Overall though, the results were very similar, with the exception of the 1% low for the RTX 2080. We discovered very early on that Hitman II seems to really hate the Ryzen processors, which is a shame because the original Hitman series running with DirectX 12 worked rather well. But for whatever reason, we went a bit backwards with this second installment. Overall though, the margins between the various GPUs remained much the same. We're just down around 20% with the AMD processor. Performance in Just Cause 4 looked pretty standard, I have to say. The 2700X was slightly slower, and this was seen with all three GPUs, so not much else to report here really. We also see a similar story when testing with Metro Exodus. The higher clocked 8700K has a slight performance advantage, and this is true regardless of the GPU used. The margins are also much the same, with performance reductions around 3 to 5%. As was the case when testing with Fortnite, we see that when testing with Project Cars 2, the GeForce GPUs have equivalent or slightly better 1% low performance when paired with the Ryzen CPU, while the opposite is true of the Radeon VII. Granted, the margins are pretty small and I wouldn't read too much into them, certainly nothing like what we saw with Assassin's Creed, for example. Okay, moving on to Resident Evil 2, and when I first ran the initial batch of tests with the Ryzen 7 2700X, there seemed to be an issue with the 1% low result. So I reran them, but I got the same 60-ish FPS. Moving on to the next GPU, and I found much the same, and in the end, after an average of 3 runs for each configuration, these are the results. For whatever reason, the Ryzen CPU suffered periods where the 1% low would drop down to around 60 FPS, meanwhile the 8700K maintained over 90 FPS. This meant the 8700K was at least 54% faster for the 1% low, but just 13% faster for the average frame rate. Performance scaling in Rainbow Six Siege was pretty consistent across all tested hardware configurations, so not much to report here really. Both the 2700X and 8700K allowed these GPUs to deliver maximum performance, or at least within a few frames of it in the case of the 2700X. Surprisingly, in the latest version of World of Tanks, the Ryzen 7 2700X was a whisker faster than the 8700K, and this was seen for all three configurations. The game has recently been updated to take advantage of multi-core processors and was designed with Ryzen in mind, so this is a very promising result for AMD users. Overall, it seems like we're seeing pretty balanced performance in 2019. Nvidia appears to have improved driver compatibility with AMD processors, and we're now seeing consistently strong frame rates on Ryzen-based CPUs, at least relative to an AMD GPU of similar capabilities. The only real outlier here was Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but as I said earlier, the Assassin's Creed series have already been proven to run pretty poorly on AMD hardware, and this is probably why AMD sponsored the latest installment and allows them to work a bit more closely with the developer to address some of the performance-related issues. Then, as expected, and titles that aren't very CPU intensive, titles such as Apex Legends, Forza Horizon 4, Fortnite, Metro Exodus, and Just Cause 4, for example, the performance margins between the 2700X and 8700K were very minor. Of course, I was testing at 1440p, which tends to be a little more GPU bound, even with a GTX 1080 Ti class GPU, but as I said, this was more of a system benchmark opposed to an individual component test where we try to remove any bottlenecks that could limit the performance of the hardware that we're examining. Anyway, it was good to see that overall performance margins were consistent across the various GPUs when using AMD and Intel processors. And that is going to do it for this one. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit the like button for us. That's much appreciated. You can subscribe for more content similar to this. And if you appreciate the work we do at Unboxed, then consider supporting us on Patreon. You can get access to our exclusive Discord chat, our monthly live streams with Tim and myself, and yeah, all that good stuff. Anyway, wrapping this up, thank you very much for watching. I am your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.